Hey everyone, so today I'm going to be doing a lesson with you on contrast, which you may not have heard as used as a literary term before, but this is a really open-ended term that I actually feel like is a really accessible one that AP is focusing quite a bit on these days. So this is a little video to kind of show you how to approach this as a literary term and give you some different ways to look at contrast and help you figure out how to analyze contrast once you identify them in a text. So this opening slide just gives you some visual representations of different ways to look at contrast. So it might be like looking at things like this zebra that are directly juxtaposed with each other. And we see the contrast as a result of that direct juxtaposition. It might also be the development of one thing that changes into something else. So like, whatever this red building is, ultimately climbing out of that into the clear blue sky. So that might be a contrast that you recognize as the change from one thing to something starkly different. It might be the weaving together of different ideas as represented here by this kind of creepy pear photo. It could be one small thing that stands out from a really continuous pattern as represented by these apples. Or it could be looking at the same thing from a different perspective, and that could be maybe a speaker shift in a text. So just some visual representations to introduce you to this concept of contrast. So here's some more official language for ways to identify contrast and then things to look at as a result of seeing that. So contrast might be introduced through any of the following. So we could look at tone, character, so characters might contrast each other, perspective, so the perspective might shift at some point in a text and represent two different points of view. A dramatic situation could change, setting could change, the type of imagery you're seeing could change, or it could be a written convention like syntax. Often contrasts will represent conflicts in values. And so that's one of the bigger things that we're trying to see as a result of identifying contrast. And that could be a conflict in value related to character, narrator, speaker perspectives, or other ideas represented by the text. And a few other important things to know, contrasts are the result of some kind of shift or perhaps juxtaposition or both, but those things kind of have to take place in some way for you to see a contrast. They might be signaled by a specific word, like for example, a conjunction like but, that would introduce some kind of contrasting idea coming. A structural convention, so like perhaps a colon could introduce a contrasting idea, or other punctuation, or it could be just a new paragraph, new stanza, whatever. And shifts may also emphasize contrast between particular segments of a text. So just a few things to kind of keep in mind as we jump into the rest of the lesson here. Some key questions you'll want to ask yourself if you are looking for contrast or if it stands out to you. So what are some striking contrasts in a text? We'll look at some examples of that. How do you identify contrast, shift, and juxtapositions? How do you see those? Again, we'll do some examples. How might a contrast interdict a conflict of values? What ideas, traits, or values are emphasized by a contrast, and how does a contrast contribute to complexity in a text, and how does contrast contribute to meaning in a text? So how can you take a contrast and help that push you towards like the theme of a text? To give you a quick example for complexity, I had one student note about Coyle in their question 2 writing that Coyle was in fact very sad, sort of and depressed and closed off and isolated on the exterior, but the student noted that there was a sense of hopefulness on the inside that was indicated by him looking at this family photo and seeing a piece of him represented there. So I thought that was an interesting way to look at a contrast and how that contributed to the complexity of character. Okay. So to go back to a text that you guys have all read, the Q2 diagnostic from Under the Feet of Jesus, I'm just going to point out some contrasts that were in there. So you might contrast Estrella with Mrs. Horn. That was the teacher that she had some bad interactions with. And some things that I wrote about that, I said Estrella has an open mind and she genuinely desires knowledge. I have some typos there. But Mrs. Horn is kind of opposed as a gatekeeper who almost tries to keep knowledge from her. So they're sort of opposed to each other. She wants knowledge, whereas Mrs. Horn keeps it away and doesn't give her what she's genuinely looking for. And why is this important? So taking that contrast, identifying it, explaining the significance of it. Estrella sees knowledge as hers for the taking, whereas Mrs. Horn sees her as undeserving because she is different. And so those are some kind of significant characterizations about those two people. Another contrast in the text, the letters of the alphabet and the tools. So we see the letters of the alphabet in the first half and the tools in the second half of that passage. The letters are mysterious and frustrating to Estrella, but then the tools are sort of practical and empowering. And these two things are in direct contrast with each other, but they do sort of represent her growth as a character. So it actually represents how Estrella changes, whereas she's confused by these letters in the beginning that are sort of like tools and doesn't understand how they function. By the end, she understands how tools work and therefore feels empowered by understanding function, and that kind of leads her into her ability to read. So we look at that contrast as actually like a growth, something that represents her growth. And the last one I noted is that Mrs. Horn's interactions with Estrella and Perfecto's interactions with her. Mrs. Horn says things to her like, "How come your mama never gave you a bath?" This is this girl's teacher. Whereas Perfecto is very straightforward with her and very instructive. He says, "Aquí, pegarlo aquí," you hold the hammer and chisel like this. And so he's very direct and upfront with her, and non-judgmental, is simply objective and explains things to her in that way. And so what's important about that is the adult's perspective on Estrella represent both their positions of power, but their impacts on Estrella represent the significance of a Sorry, I was fixing my slide. I had some obvious typo on there. But anyway, the significance of this one is that the adult's perspective on Estrella represent their positions of power, but their impacts on Estrella also represent the significance of a teacher's impact on a child's life. So taking some of those contrasts and explaining why they're important. Okay, so I'm going to move on to talking about some other contrasts in poetry. So we read The Unknown Citizen earlier in this week, and so I thought I would pull out some contrasts from that poem and explain the function or effect of those contrasts. And this is exactly what I'm going to have you guys do with the poem that you're going to be reading, which is called Theme for English B by Langston Hughes. So one of the first contrasts that I indicated here, this is from kind of the beginning of the poem, and where it says, he was found by the Bureau of Statistics to be one against who there was no official complaint, and all the reports on his conduct agree that in the very modern sense of an old-fashioned word, he was a saint. And so I pointed out the contrast between no official complaint and saint, and that there's a contrast in the perspective of what a saint actually is. So there's an obvious contrast between like what the audience or the reader would expect, and probably what the poet expects, and what the speaker of this poem actually indicates. And so what this emphasized, a saint would be somebody who does a lot more than not get complained about. So there's a contrast in what we understand a saint being there. And so the function or the effect of this is that it emphasizes that dissent or straying from norms is ultimately frowned upon. So what makes you saintly in this, world, whatever this is simply not doing anything to cause a ripple or to cause any trouble. And that way you'll be called a saint, versus, the actual expectation would be that you actually do something notable in your life. Here, it's more like just do what you're told and don't get complained about, and that will make you a saint. So in any case, the function or the effect is an indicating of a difference in values, probably between the poet and the content that he is creating. So emphasizes that dissent or straying from norms is frowned upon. The next contrast I noticed was the line where it said that he held all the proper opinions. When there was peace, he was for peace, and when there was war, he went. So again, I think that there is a contrast in perspective here. And what I wrote about the function or the effect of this one is that this actually kind of introduces a paradox. Someone whose opinions that just go along with whatever the powers that be say to be correct isn't actually someone who holds opinions at all. That's just somebody who is being told what to think and is accepting that. So this brings up a contrast again between what is an actual opinion, and how does that actually get valued. So proper opinions really just means a mind that is controlled. So the contrast in this line between having proper opinions and that having opinions and then just doing what you're told to do, indicates that this is a world where opinions aren't actually valued in any way. So I feel like that one kind of introduced a paradox. And the last contrast that I pointed out was from the very end of the poem, we have two very tiny questions. Was he free? Was he happy? And that syntax is contrasted with the rest of the poem. And so the effect or the function, I wrote the only questions in the poem exist in the end in sort of an endless array of these faux achievements and statements of ironic grandeur, which indicates the actual drowning out of questioning voices, pushing for conformity over individualism. So that contrasts this very, very tiny piece of questioning, this sort of questioning voice that doesn't even seem to be the voice of the speaker at all. It seems to be maybe another voice, actually indicates that those voices just get drowned out by being told what to think by the rest of society and all the establishments that the poet mentions. So anyway, some of the contrasts I noticed and the functions and effects of those. So what you guys are going to be doing is trying the same thing. You're going to be reading Theme for English B by Langston Hughes. And what I'd like you to do is read the poem, annotate the poem, do what you need to do to understand the poem. And then I want you to make this chart just like off to the side of the poem or on the back of the paper. And I want you to try to list out like at least 5 or 6 contrasts that you noticed and write out what you think the function or the effect of those contrasts is. And we will bring this back to class and discuss it next time. All right, guys, hope this was helpful, at least somewhat. I'm really tired, so hopefully that made sense. And if it didn't, we'll go over it next class. All right, guys, good luck. Let me know if you have questions, and I'll see you next time.